just before coming home, my brother-in-law rang me and said, we need to put something on Gabriella's headstone. And he said, what do you think we should put on it? And we talked about it. And then I remember sitting back thinking, what would they say on my headstone? Vice President of Microsoft, soon to be or potentially be senior Vice President. I thought, well, fuck that. I wanted to say, successful technology executive, great husband, great father, great member of the community, and great friend. I wanted to, now you can only say those things if you've done those things. So I literally set about recasting my life so that I could, as much as possible, tick those boxes and say I've spent time, I've spent resources in terms of time. I've been very thoughtful about my interaction with my children and my wife and my friends and charities, my work. I've allotted time to be efficient at work so I have more time for my family. So yeah, it became this driving force to prove you can do it.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and you are listening to episode 180 of the Startup Playbook podcast, a weekly series where I sit down with successful tech founders, investors, and operators to unpack their journey, lessons, and insights to help current and future entrepreneurs. The voice that you heard a little bit earlier was that of our guest for this episode, Daniel Petre. Daniel is the godfather of the Australian tech and VC landscape. In 1988, he joined Microsoft Director for Australia before being promoted as one of the 5 VPs of product under Bill Gates. He would then go on to launch a number of successful venture capital funds, most recently co-founding AirTree, which is one of the 3 largest venture capital funds in Australia. Any introduction I give about Daniel won't do justice to the incredible things that he's achieved across his career, aside to say that he's been one of the most influential people in shaping the Australian startup ecosystem into what it is today. He now spends his time focused on philanthropic efforts as a founder of Start Giving, which helps to inspire tech founders and execs to start their philanthropic journey. In this episode, we covered everything from how to get the most out of your investors and board to the importance of doing the right thing, family time, and giving back. I've been wanting to interview Daniel for a very long time, and I'm excited to finally share this conversation with you. But before we get into this interview, just a few quick notes from me. Something we speak about in this interview is how founders and high-achieving execs face many challenges along their journey, particularly when they're thrown into the deep end and have to figure things out as they go along their journey. These challenges can come in many forms, and something that comes up time and time again, especially for SaaS companies selling to large enterprise customers, is how difficult, time-consuming, and expensive it can be to get their ISO 27001 and SOC 2 compliance. These certifications are so important in building credibility and trust with large enterprise customers, but can be such a big distraction and operational drain for early stage startups. Thankfully, there's a tool to help with this. Vanta helps companies get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the workflow for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. There are over 6,000 fast-growing companies that use Vanta to manage their risk and prove their security in real time. To watch their 3-minute demo video or to speak to a local team member, head over to vanta.com/playbook. And something else that we discussed in this interview is the importance of surrounding yourself with the right people to help you navigate all areas of your life, from work to family to your finances. And that's why I'm delighted to partner with Sender. Sender is the OG startup accounting firm in Australia, catering to all stages of your business life. If you're busy running your startup, you don't always have the time to do your own books or forecasts. And instead, you can fully outsource your finance function to give you the time and resources back to do what you do best, which is growing your business. They have a dedicated focus on founders, funders, and startups, and have an experienced team that can help you with everything from balancing your books to managing your tax to even helping with your exit strategy. I trust and use them with all of my businesses and can't recommend them highly enough. To find out more or to speak to Gareth and the team, head over to sender.com. With that out of the way, and without any further ado, here is my interview with Daniel Petre. Hi, Daniel. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast. I've been so excited to have you on for such a long time. Great to finally get you on the show.
Rohit, that's very, very kind. I hope I do justice to the podcast.
Given the notes that I have for this interview, I'm sure we're going to have an amazing conversation.
Let's score it at the end and see. Okay.
So Daniel, maybe for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Well, I'm very old, so the backstory is a bit long, but the short version is I did computer science at university and statistics, double major. Went into computing as a programmer. This is in the mainframe days. Ended up in a couple of computing companies, national marketing director at one, and then joined Microsoft as running the Australian operation, managing director of Australia, very small operation in those days. And then that was my luckiest break in life. And then I was very fortunate to be promoted to the US to run one of the 5 product groups. reporting to Bill. I ran Workgroup, which is sort of all the Outlook and the messaging products. And that was an amazing experience. Had a family tragedy in Australia, which then brought us back home. Ran Asia Pacific for Microsoft. And that wasn't that much fun after having worked so close with the sort of the operating team at Microsoft. It was much harder then to go back to the subsidiaries and work in that environment. So I left and started a venture capital career. And I've had 3 VC firms in the last 28 years, all been successful, fortunate, I can say. Or at least AirTree's still going, but is successful. And then decided to retire from venture capital about 2 years ago and focus a lot more on philanthropy. And that's probably the main thrust of my life now is philanthropy.
Yeah, love it. For anyone listening that isn't familiar with your background, obviously you can tell so many different threads and things for us to talk about. But maybe, starting off, as you mentioned, doing an undergrad in computer science and statistics, which, I guess is a lot more popular now, given where we are in the state of the world. But I imagine back then was not a very popular decision. And from what I understand as well, it was your 4th choice.
Yeah, well,
pretty
much, yeah. I wanted to do, my first choice, I wanted to be a fighter pilot and do aeronautical engineering. And long story short, 2,000 applicants, last 35, they chose 30. So I missed out there. Then I wanted to do medicine and I was on track to get the right mark. But then I had basically a nervous breakdown in my last exam, Industrial Arts 3 unit, and couldn't even write my name on the paper. I think I'd overstudied, and it was the last exam, so literally couldn't write, and that was just enough. The lack of marks out of that exam was enough to tip me under. And you didn't really have very good career advisory then, so I then thought, well, what will I do? And all my friends were doing engineering. I thought, I'm not going to do that because they're all doing it, so I went and did computer science. So it partly was, I thought, gee, computers, they're going to be pretty important. And you could just see, and that was mainframe days, right? You could just see the increasing importance. And this was in 78. So that started me down. And I liked statistics, I liked math. So I tacked on a honours stats degree as well.
Yeah. And it's sometimes funny how, the things that we think that we want and just the path that we sort of get led down by accident sometimes are like the things that, is like life redirecting us to the things that we should be doing.
Yeah, I still got a tremendous interest in health in particular. And we've funded 3 chairs in medical research over the years, and I was chairman of Sydney Children's Hospital Westmead for a number of years, on the board of it as well. So I've stayed very close to health, and I think if I had my time again, I probably would have found a way to try and see if I could do medicine. I may have failed, but I think I would have tried to. I've got a deep love of health and medicine, and I also think it's a very honourable career. Not quite sure all computer science degrees are honourable, but medicine would have been a bit more so.
Yeah. And obviously you touched on your career with Microsoft, which again, in hindsight, everyone knows what Microsoft is, everyone knows who Bill Gates is, but I imagine that back in the 80s when you joined, wasn't as well known. No, this was well before Windows. Windows 3.0 was the sort of really birth of Microsoft, and this was well before Windows 3.0. So we were in sort of the pre-graphical user interface world. Microsoft in Australia had, I think, 25 employees at the time. It was doing revenue of about 17 million or something less. So it was quite small, and it wasn't as well known as you say. But I was at a hardware company called NEC, which no one has ever heard of. It was actually doing it was the number 1 personal computer supplier in Australia, actually beating IBM and Compaq and Toshiba in those days, and Dell towards the end. But I figured out that hardware was a pretty terrible place to be because it was commoditized. There was no differentiation in hardware, so therefore your margins were small, and so it was hard to grow a business. But I thought software would have high differentiation. You in those days you either bought Microsoft Word or Microsoft Word Perfect. There was a conscious decision on the feature set of those products. It wasn't a marginalized environment, and I liked that. I liked the idea that your product could differentiate you, and the consumers would make a choice. So I wanted to get into software. And just by luck, they were recruiting the Microsoft MD role, and so I got called up by the headhunter. So it was sort of this interesting time because I'd come to the conclusion I wanted to get into software, and I was just thinking about it, and then literally 2 months later I get this call. Yeah,
so.
And I think you kind of mentioned in another interview where your previous role at NEC was as a marketing director, and you sort of wanted to challenge yourself as well. Like I guess fast forwarding through a lot of your career, it kind of looks like you've always sort of taken the leap, and even for people around you that you've mentored in similar ways as well. Has that always been a core part of your approach?
I think it's not fear of failure So I was marketing director at NEC, and I was doing quite well. And I thought, I want to see if I can be an MD. I'd done an MBA, so I had some finance background training, and I was a technology guy by birth. So I had a couple of things, and I understood marketing pretty well. So I thought I'll give it a go, but I had no sense that I was going to be good at it. And I was quite happy that if I failed at it, I go, well, that wasn't for me. I'll go back and be a marketing director. And I think in each of my leaps, when I went to run a product group in Seattle, and I was one of the 5 product heads, I wasn't very good at it. I could spin some story to you about, which is true, we tripled revenue over a 2-year period, we tripled our market share. So I could spin a story that clearly I was good at it, but I wasn't. I was hanging on by my fingernails. I knew I wasn't very good at it. I knew I was out of my depth in terms of what was needed to be a VP of a product group. So I left for reasons not that I was crap at my job. Bill was quite happy to let me continue on. I left because of the family issue, but I'm quite open to say, no, I wasn't very good at that job. And I don't think there's anything, I think being honest about how you're performing is really important, and trying to detach yourself from your performance. You are not your performance in a job.
Yeah.
You are a multifaceted human being with many good and bad attributes, and you may not be good at all things. Who knew? And so I think accepting that is really important, and then trying to find things you think you might be good at and that bring you joy.
Yeah.
So I've constantly been on that journey of, let me try things, see if I'm any good at them. If I'm not, that's fine. It's a learning experience. If I am, that's great. And then do I enjoy it as well? And there are some times where you lose enjoyment for something you've had, and that's also okay. It was good for a while, kind of thing.
Yeah. In terms of that learning opportunity, as you mentioned, like no one's born to know how to be a VP of an organization if they haven't done that before. I've had a couple of recent episodes with Luke and Ian from Safety Culture and Ben Thompson from Employment
Know
Hero.
them both well. Yeah.
And both of them kind of mentioned about, Luke especially, about how a lot of conversations with Scott and Mike, for example, spoke to him about building or growing with the opportunity. And like the biggest risk for him was not being able to grow at the rate that those things needed.
Yes.
Not that he needed to be there, but he needed to learn how to become those things. Sounds like you had to go through similar journeys with the trajectory that you had with a large part of your career. What are some of the ways, or like how did you go about learning those things or identifying those sort of areas for growth or development?
I think in any environment that's growing very, very fast, you can't assume that just because you have that job today, you are well qualified tomorrow. And that's a real problem with founders. Not all founders, or not all founders' direct reports, can grow at the rate that the company's growing. And so being honest, that accepting that this thing's growing beneath you and you may not be growing fast enough is a really important realization. And then taking steps to try to address that. In Luke's case, he, as you say, took advice from Mike and Scott. In my case, I was very lucky that I had this guy you may have heard of called Bill Gates, who I worked for, who was a fantastic mentor, and to try how to grow. Even when I landed in the job, I knew that, wow, this is going to be a stretch. And then of course we grew very, very fast. We went from sort of 200 engineers to 500 engineers in a 2-year period. And I knew that I had to pedal really, really fast to try and keep up with this machine. And so I sought out ways to improve my skill set. So I think that is important is realizing that you don't, just because you're holding a job doesn't give you a lifelong role in that job, particularly if the job is growing, or the company, I should say, is growing beneath you, or the scale of the job's growing. And then taking concrete steps to search out the best you can find to try and learn from. And that's in any job, is that sense of, I've always looked around and thought, am I being subjected to negative role modeling or positive role modeling? At NEC, I'd had some incredibly negative role modeling, and I was young at the time, and I could see myself starting to model some of the behaviors of people who were not good role models. And I think it was useful that I actually picked up on that and thought, hang on a second, I don't want to turn out like them. And then I was lucky that I had the inverse in the Microsoft experience.
And, again, in hindsight, Microsoft and Bill Gates are obvious. But, as with investing, in hindsight, everything's obvious, and you can sort of identify things. We were speaking about a company that we've both invested in, and a founder, Mark Woodland, and, James and I had the benefit of investing in Mark at Kismet post-Explore days, and he's got the data points there to kind of show that. But one thing that James and I have always spoken about is, how do we identify Mark when they haven't had their second or third go and it's the first time founder, and how do you draw out those things? But yeah, I guess from your perspective, what was it specifically about Bill Gates and Microsoft that made it such a successful company, and how does that translate to what you look for in founders?
Yeah, okay. So first, Bill Gates is an outlier, in the sense incredibly bright, like so super high IQ, and he has a photographic memory, and he is very, very articulate. So the super smart guy who forgets nothing, who can is very articulate and also can take a very complex thing and summarize it in a way that a 5-year-old could understand. It's an incredible skill. So I think in his case, is watching how he approached problems and how he parsed out the important parts, the noise from the signal from the noise, and then communicating what was important was a super important set of lessons. And I think I've talked about in the past, in his case, one of the great lessons I got from Bill was this sense of spending real intellectual energy in planning. And everyone talks about, we planned, but serious planning. Because if you've done serious planning for anything, a product, a launch, a revenue model, and something goes wrong, you'll know exactly what went wrong and why. You'll know which variable didn't execute as it should have. And then you'll be able to take steps. And usually then it's not a complete clusterfuck. It's, a tangential move. If you haven't done the right level of planning and something goes wrong, you actually don't know what actually went wrong and why. So I think that is a lesson that stayed with me for it's helped benefited my life across family, children, hobbies, everything. This sense of really getting a sufficient data set on what you want to do, and then knowing how to measure your success in that hobby or that business. Now, in the case of startup, there's a lot of folklore to the startup community and to VC investing, and I've been a venture capital investor for 27 years. Surprisingly, there was success in venture capital before 2012, which seems to be there was a Cambrian explosion in 2012, but we had 2 funds prior to 2012 that were successful, 4 times cash on cash in each case. Now, having said that, nobody has the perfect sauce on picking a founder. And one of the things that's annoying about the startup community and the investing side is venture funds or venture partners or general partners who sort of kind of pretend like they always knew. Well, of course, if that was true, then all their investments would be successful. And yet we hear often about this thing which also annoys me called the power law, which isn't a law. It's not like physics. It's an anecdotal review of the past data that an investment will return your fund, etc. But, no one really knows. So even when I'll now answer the question specifically about Mark, you don't really know. You're looking for sort of proxy data to hopefully make the right decision. Now, in Mark's case at that time, he had an incredibly strong vision for the product he wanted to ship. And by that I mean he knew the use case very well because, of course, he was involved in childcare. He had childcare centres and his mother was involved in childcare centres. So he understood. It wasn't like he woke up one morning and said, I think I'm going to design a rocket ship. It was like, no, I know this space. I know the pain points. I know the difficulties in running a childcare centre well, both from all 3, from the government perspective in terms of funding, from parents and kids at the centre, and also from childcare workers. So understood the case and had a really strong vision of what would make it better using technology. So that discovery process of the use case was incredibly strong, built on really good data. And he was a visionary in that sense, that he had a vision for creating something that no one had ever done in childcare in terms of the sort of set of software solutions they brought to market. He would agree, I think, that he was not very operationally focused. He wasn't an incredibly strong detail person. So he needed support beneath him in terms of very strong COO and CTOs to run the organization, because his real ability was this sort of overall product vision, overall understanding of the consumer use case, or the double-sided use case there, and also what it took to compete. It wasn't in the how do you actually build a product or how do you manage a team of 80, 100 people.
Yeah. I mean, I think we referenced it on my interview with him, but he told me the story about how AirTree first reached out to him. So I believe it was Paul Bennett who emailed him. Yep. He didn't know what a VC was and told you to stuff off, and you kindly responded to him and said, I don't think you know who we are in the nicest possible terms. But one other thing that you kind of referenced was competition. And at that time, I think, again, Mark mentioned that they had about 5 childcare centres that were customers, and the biggest player in that market had 100.
Yes.
Again, as it's kind of one of those things about early stage investing where, everyone says it's too early, it's whatever, like you need more of those data points. What was that line or trajectory that you saw that, you could see where it was heading, but
my bias, and this is not necessarily a good bias, but I'm a product guy. So I am far more on the best product should win. Now, it doesn't always for a whole bunch of reasons, but that's my starting point usually is if someone has a vision for and can create a better product, similar price point, yada, yada, then they should win. And Mark had, and we did some investigation in the sector, and we had the view, by the way, very, 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 very similar to the hot dog experience with Ben at Hot Dog versus Health Engine. And I'll come back to that. It's another good use case. Mark had a vision for a much better product, and he literally to the sort of screenshots of what it should look like. And the bet we took was that, that's a better answer. That's a better mousetrap. And often incumbents, and still today, incumbents tend to be quite slow. Now, the opportunity for a startup is to scale quicker than the incumbent pivots, right? And in their case, the incumbent wasn't pivoting. They were sort of confident in their market share and their position. They felt the market was locked up because it was difficult for childcare centres to churn off their software. But we bet that Mark had a much better product for all participants in the value chain there, and that it, over time would work. In Ben's case, it was probably even more graphic. When we backed Ben at Hot Dog had maybe 2% of the number of GPs that Health Engine had. Like, it had near nobody compared to what Health Engine had. Yet we looked at both offerings. We actually talked to a number of people in the market and just felt, no, Ben and Tom, his one of the co-founders, had a much better vision of the product and what needed. Now, Ben's mum's a GP. So it wasn't, again, he didn't just wake up one morning and decide I'm going to do a better GP booking engine. And it worked. And you could just track Hot Dog success month over month, year over year. And now it completely dominates the GP market. Now, at the same time, Health Engine raised probably 4 times the amount of capital that Hot Dog raised, yet was not able to stem the flow of churn away from their own platform, let alone innovate and take share back from Hot Dog.
Yeah. One other thing that Mark mentioned, well, he mentioned several things, but one of the other things that he mentioned was just, one of the real values of having an investor who has your back and is super fair. And he gave 2 specific examples. One was, I think it's a story that we've spoken about before, about a senior employee at Explore that wasn't quite sort of working out. And I think Mark found that sort of transition a little bit difficult. But, and it is hard internally. Like, there are all of these challenges that founders have to go through. But again, do you want to maybe share from like a VC perspective in terms of the role that investors can potentially help founders in those types of
and I think that also, so I think that, we won't go into the details, but the specific detail was a very, very senior person was adding no value really to the company and causing a lot of heartache. And Mark really not only didn't know how to deal with it, but didn't know what the steps were. And it required someone to really lean in and get their hands dirty in the operations of the company to try and create a much better forward path for the business. Now, there are 2 parts of that. One is you need to build the trust with the founder. They're going to give you the keys to their car, or moreover, they're going to let you mind their children. It's more than the car ride. It's more like minding their children. And secondly, you got to know what the fuck you're doing. And I think often, sadly, in venture capital, people are giving founders advice and they have no idea what they're talking about. They've never done it. They've never operated a team, hired people, fired people, built product. So their advice comes from reading a few blog posts. And there's 2 things wrong with that. Firstly, it doesn't build trust with the founder, because the founder can tell pretty quickly whether you're authentic. So you don't build the trust and you actually don't know what you're doing. So I think it is incumbent on investors to be authentic and honest with their founders. Either you say, look, here's some money, but basically we don't know what the fuck we're doing operationally, but here's some money and we wish you the best. Or here's some money and we do have expertise either internally or through associates or colleagues or parts of our network that we can really help you. And here they are and here's their track record. But I think where you see VCs who will purport to do the latter and then put a 24-year-old associate as the contact for that company, and the person spent 2 years in investment banking prior to now being an associate at a VC firm, that's dangerous and disrespectful to the founder and to the process, I think. So I think there is a bit of maturity required in our industry to be authentic about what it is you're really providing that company. And in some cases, I look back at our investment, Paul Bennett's, when I say found Mel at Canva, Mel knew who she was at Canva. In terms of us, we'd never met Mel, and there'd only been 2 rounds prior. I think there'd been the Accelerating Commercialisation Australia grant, and then there was a $6 million round, and then there was a 25 round, and that was before AirTree was founded. So we were founded in 2014. And Paul said, hey, you've got to meet Mel from Canva. So I was the first AirTree investing partner to meet her. And the moment you met her, and I said this at the time, by the way, so I haven't sort of back-sold for a narrative, which I think is also interesting about our industry. At the time, I can remember coming and presenting, and they had no revenue at that point in time. They just had this chart that went sort of vertical on not only number of users, but number of users who weren't churning away. And when you see growth like that with bugger all marketing and not churning away, there's something absolutely magical happening, and that there will be a way to find revenue. And I can remember leaving the meeting just feeling, this doesn't happen. She is a unicorn in the true sense. She's very, very smart, very driven, and they're building something quite extraordinary at Canva. And really for her, it was kind of like, please take our money. There was no suggestion, I think, on our behalf that we could add value to Canva. Now, I'm sure Blackbird, who are deeper into Canva, and some of the other US investors have maybe added some value, but we were quite open, I think, with, look, we've got experience, but you are accelerating so fast and you're so good, I'm not sure you need much help, but please take our money.
What does that process look like? And have there been other founders similar to Melanie that you've found in those types of situations?
No, I think one of the great things and weird things about the Australian ecosystem is that there is no one else like Canva. We've never seen anyone else like Canva in this ecosystem. Scott Farquhar's a very, very good friend of mine. Atlassian's an extraordinary company, but Atlassian's growth wasn't as fast, nor was it as impactful early on in the ecosystem because it kind of IPO'd, and the people who did well out with the IPO, whereas in Canva you've had all these investors and funds and employees doing very, very well prior up to IPO, whenever it will be. So, and the problem is it does pollute people's thinking. Oh, where's the next Canva? Well, those things just don't come along that often, and we have to respect that we are seeing one of the greatest Australian companies ever. Forget tech companies. This is one of the greatest companies that will ever be created out of Australia, bar none. And we need to celebrate it. We need to learn from it. We need to leverage it, but also go, hey, a company that just happens to go 10x in 5 or 10 years is actually still pretty good, and not say, but it's not like Canva. So no, I don't think there are very, very good founders, very, very good founders across the board, across many subsectors and sectors. But the combination of a very good founder with a success, I think it's unlikely to be seen for quite some time.
Yeah, and it's I think it's always sometimes a little bit difficult for founders to understand what does really, really good or really exceptional look like, because their exposure is, their data set is one of one.
Yes.
They've just got the focus internally of their company. I guess investors have the benefit of seeing multiple different companies and have different reference points. And obviously, I imagine over your years across 3 different venture funds over the last 20 odd years, you would have seen hundreds, thousands of companies. I guess, I know it's difficult to quantify, but if you were to try and quantify, what does the bar, what does exceptional look like for you when you meet a founder?
Look, I think that's a really good question. I think we get, there are some overlaying thematics now that I think distort what the answer to that is. One of them now is that every investment has to pay back the fund. So you've got a $100 million core fund or a $200 million core fund, and you're going to write a $2 million check. Now, you might run a follow-on $2 or $3 million, but basically that investment has to pay back the fund. So it's got to like somewhere between 100x, or if you put a bit more, it's 40x to be successful. And I know funds that will not invest in a company unless they can believe that that's going to be a 40 or 100x return. I think that signaling to the founder that you're not really good enough is ridiculous. I think if you can meet a company, this is the way I see it, I'm not saying others should agree, and you think that company, you can make 5 times your money in that company over a 3 to 5 year period, that is exceptional on any normal metric in the normal world, because your IRR, your internal rate of return, is going to be north of 40% over that period, 35 to 40%. Show me anywhere in the world where someone is disappointed with getting a 35 or 40% IRR over 5 years. But the problem is, because that's not enough to pay back the fund, the fund isn't that excited and the founder's not excited. So I do think we've got to be very careful that we don't start to, we're doing it already, where we're starting to sort of signal to founders that unless you're 100x, you're not really successful. If you've got a company that is, there's an interesting discussion going on in the US now about funds that will only invest in companies growing 100% or more a year. Now, the backstory to that is firstly, a lot of funds in Australia and the US that heavily invested in sort of 21 are now looking, they've got maybe half of their investment pool left, and the fund is looking pretty much underwater because of that. So they now have to swing for the fences to try and recover that fund. So of course they're going to be looking for the 100% year on year. But that's not the founder's issue, that's their fund economics issue, right, driving that. And the second thing is, it is disingenuous to suggest that a company that is growing 25 or 30 or 40% year on year is not successful. Now, if your company is growing 35% year on year and your competitor is growing 200% year on year, you're in trouble, okay? But if you look around that competitive landscape and you are actually growing faster than others, and you're taking share, and it might be a slower process because it's got a regulatory framework in place with government intervention that means it's slower to onboard customers, or there's clinical trials or whatever. There are things that mean your growth isn't as fast. But when you get the growth, you're not losing customers, you're getting good ACV, your CAC ratio is fantastic in terms of the LTV versus CAC. All the other metrics are great, then that's a good investment. So I do think founders need to not just read the sort of headlines from the blog posts about what success means, and step back into the real world. If I've got good unit economics, I am taking share from all my competitors, it's a market segment that's still providing growth opportunities, and I'm only growing by 25 or 30% or 40%, that's okay. I should feel proud of that. And so the majority of successes in a portfolio will in fact be that cohort. It'll be the couple that knock it out of the park and get all the press, but all these other ones that maybe they returned half the fund or a quarter of the fund or a third of the fund. In Mark's case, I have Explore as a tremendous success story. We made just over 3 times our money, a 33% IRR. Now it only returned, I think, a third of the fund, maybe a quarter of the fund, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the fund. Now, on normal metrics, didn't return the fund. Hang on, 33% IRR over the period we held it, and 3 times cash on cash. I think that's pretty good.
It's also interesting that you mentioned the challenges that funds have aren't necessarily the problems of the founders as well. And one of the other stories that Mark mentioned was that in the Explore acquisition process, there were clauses in the contract that you and AirTree could have enacted but didn't, because it wasn't the fair thing to do from a founder perspective. Obviously, the right thing to do is the right thing to do, but it is hard when there are financials at play. But I guess there is a longer term horizon with a lot of these sort of opportunities as well with Mark, which is not just this investment with him and the return that you get specifically from that, but the opportunity then to go back again with his next company. Yeah,
it's not even, and you're right, you're absolutely right. To me, it's a lot deeper. It's actually doing the right thing. There is a power dynamic that exists, generally speaking, between venture capital firms and founders. other than the Canva case where the power sits with the Canva. But generally speaking, the VC firm has all the money, is providing the funding to the founder. If the founder complains about the VC firm, people will believe the VC firm usually, well, there's something wrong with you, So there's a terrible power dynamic. And you have all the experience, you have all the legal advice. You need to use those powers carefully. And I have always, throughout all my decades, put founders first. Now, there have been a couple of cases where the founders have acted fraudulently, immorally, illegally, in which case I'm on the other side of the coin. But if someone is really trying to do their best and they are trusting you and believing in you as a VC, and they've hocked their house, they've taken cuts in income, it is your job to do the right thing by the founder. Now there was the Explore case was interesting because there was an opportunity there where we could have taken, in the restructuring post the employee leaving, AirTree could have taken a whole bunch of shares back to AirTree, really about 30% of the company. We could have taken it back. We didn't. We took a small proportion and literally gave the rest back for free to Mark because I thought that he had made a big mistake in the way he structured the cap table. It was an honest mistake. It would be inappropriate for us to try and get the winnings of taking that across. We were still going to do very, very well out of it. And the right thing to do was now, I don't know how many other firms would have done that, but that felt the right thing to do, was to literally give back that big chunk of equity to him, not keep it, and build a relationship. And then the primary thing is you put your head in your pillow at night and say, I've done the right thing. Now, subsequent to that, if you get opportunity, if Mark goes into the ecosystem and talks about you and your firm as being a positive influence on him and helpful, that helps with other founders and helps you getting investments from other people. But that's kind of the second order. The first order is, have you done the right thing? And don't hide behind the financials. Don't go, oh yeah, but it's about the money. I just think it's wrong. And I think when any investor hides behind what's right for the investment, I think it's wrong, particularly in venture capital where you have this power dynamic going on.
Yeah, so playing those long-term games. But I guess...
it's more than long-term. It's we're all going to die at some point. And I think for most of us, there are a few sociopaths, I know a couple, but most of us want to feel we're good people. And that has to come from doing the right thing. It can't just come from some abstract thought. It's got to, that you've woken up every day and you've tried your best to do the right thing. Now, it can play out in long-term issues, but it starts at a fundamental of doing the right thing by the people around you.
Yeah. From a founder perspective, it can be, again, it was something Mark and I have spoken about, and I've also spoken about this to other founders as well, of just, everyone tells you that they're in your corner until they're not, until it gets difficult.
Yes.
And as you said, the power dynamics are so tough. And to be honest, from a founder perspective, fundraising is really hard. Yes. If someone believes in you when there's not a lot of people believing in you, you want to believe that they will always be in your corner, but it doesn't always work out like that. Again, this can be very tough to gauge until you're kind of through that situation. But is there any way that founders can test that, or ways that founders should be able to...
Look, every VC firm will tell you we're there for the long term. We're always there for you. In a lot of cases, we're there for the long term as long as you're doing really, really well. And I can think of a number of examples in our own firm where people gave up on founders and it required other people to lean in a disproportionate way. By that I mean, we could have let that in. I can think of one in particular. We could have let that investment go. It was a $750K investment in a $62 million fund, which was already looking as being a 10x fund, right? So its impact on fund returns was zero. And yet for that founder had worked just as hard as any other founder in our portfolio, whether it's a Mark or a Ben or a Melanie Cliff and Cam Adams. So what happens often in VC firms, and it's across the board internationally, is that they'll tend to focus a lot on the ones doing well, and the ones that are struggling will have less and less and less attention. And I think the danger is nowhere to go. They can't complain about the VC firm, as you talked earlier, because people will believe the firm, and no one will then help them. They probably can't get another round away because their primary funding, particularly if the VC firm hasn't lent in on a second round. It's bad signaling. So I think, again, this power dynamic that exists, we have this responsibility as investors to understand the power dynamic, particularly on companies that are struggling, with founders that are trying to do the right thing. That's the other caveat. If they are, then you should do everything you can to try and help that founder at least come out with some of their ordinary shares paying back. Now, you may not get all, the way pref stacks work, you may get your money back, but if you get your money back and also the founder ends up with getting some financial return, then you've done the right thing, rather than let it fall over and all you get is your pref stack, or it falls over completely and it doesn't really impact your profitability of your fund. And it is easy to get caught up in that. We'll just spend time with the companies that are doing well, or can be taken from a 2x to a 4x, or from a 1x to a 3x, and let the other ones fall. I think it's the wrong thing to do. I think the right thing to do is to lean in as much as you can to help the ones that are struggling to get back to a 1x. It helps you in terms of you don't lose money, but more importantly, it helps the founder get some return for their many years of effort.
Is fund size a consideration for founders on that, from that perspective? So by nature, a larger fund will be split across a larger portfolio, and as a result you'll have less one-on-one time with partners, or
I think that's a really good question. So to come back to first, what can founders do? I didn't answer the question properly. Founders should talk to many companies in the portfolio of the VC funds they're talking to, and not just the celebrated brands that have done well. Search out the founders of companies that may have not done well or aren't doing well, and get firsthand, in a confidential way, what those founders think about that VC firm. That'll be the most authentic and honest evaluation of what it's like to be a founder working with that firm in difficult situations, rather than you ring up, someone, a Mark who's done really well, and they'll talk well about AirTree because it's been a great outcome for all. So I think that's the primary thing. Fund size is a problem if I think I'm unique in the industry thinking this, but I think it's the larger funds, and we raise larger funds at AirTree too, as some other firms do, is you have this sort of swing for the fences. You need to pay back the fund, and you have 100 or 200 investors, 150. How do you make sure you're doing the right thing by all? And so there are funds that don't have such big footprints. I think if you look at the US example, which is a bit abstract marker to look at, probably one of the best firms in the US is Union Square Ventures. Now, they could easily have raised $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion fund. They could have done an A16Z or a Sequoia or whatever. They never have. They've always stayed within a sort of 250 to 375 million. And why? And you read some of their posts, or you talk to any of the founders, and it's because they want to have a portfolio that they can see and they can all work on. Now, their argument would be that, if we have a $250 million portfolio in the US versus $2 billion and we 2x it, we're still going to do very well financially, but we will be in touch more with all of our companies. And so I think that does translate. It translates the amount of time and effort you can put into all the companies. You can get an understanding for that if you look at the makeup of a firm and how many people are working on investing or working with either investing or working with investments versus how many are in the marketing, portfolio analysis, investor relations, financial accounting, and see where the resources are sitting to understand how much time will I get from that firm.
Yeah. I guess also a lot of focus goes into how do you get investment, or how do you get a VC to say yes. What is probably less talked about is how do you effectively work with your partner, work with that fund specifically through a board structure. Any advice from the numerous boards that you sort of sit on, or those sort of things about just how founders can really leverage that?
The most important thing is when you're going for institutional funding, so you come out of the family and friends rounds, is never have just one VC as part of the round. Now, all generally a round will dilute you 10 to 20%, usually, sometimes a bit less, hopefully never more, because you run out of room after a few rounds. most VC firms will want to, if they like it, will want to go deep and early. So they'll want 10%, 15% of the company. I think that's problematic because I think what you want is two heavyweights in the room. So the push-pull is the VC say, oh, we want 15, so we think you're fantastic, Rohit, we want to do 15% of the company. The right thing, if you don't want to dilute more than 20, you say, no, the maximum cap is 10, and you find someone else because you've got to solve for, in X weeks, months, years' time, you wake up and they don't like you anymore. If you've got one big investor and you come up around for the second round, some firms are very good about giving you another swing. They'll do the second round. Some won't. So now you have the situation where you've had a firm come into your first round. They've taken effectively all the round, or all the institutional allocation of that round. You come to the next round and they're not there. Well, that's a disaster from a signaling perspective. Also, if you've got two firms there is some competition between them, if not others, to the next round. So you're sort of buying insurance and you're buying a diversification of opinion. You now have two very experienced, deep firms, investing firms, who can give you advice. And what it required you to do is say, no, you can't have 15, you can have 7. Now, my experience is that if it's a really good company, a really good opportunity, of course they'd want 15. But are they going to say no to 7.5% of a really good opportunity? Of course not. They'll take it. So that's the first thing, is to make sure you try and have this diversification of investment at the get-go with your first institutional round. In terms of board seats, no one should get a board seat at less than 10%. You could have information rights, but not a board seat. And make sure the board is structured so you control the company. And be very, very careful for situations where a minority investor could control the company. Now, there will of course be things like you've got to operate within a budget and you can't go and send shares over the wall to anyone you want, obvious things. But in the operation of the company, you got to make sure you've got the trust of the investors and you're controlling your company and you're running it, because you're the one who cares most about that company.
Speaking of kind of building the company itself, a large part of that is then surrounding yourself with the right people. And an example of this is Alison Deans, who I spoke to as part of the research process for this interview. She mentioned, I think you were interviewing her as part of the joint venture for when you were launching eBay.
Yeah.
And I think you just reached out to her cold, I think through mutual contact, and I think she said, I came prepared for a conversation the next day, which was meant to be an hour, ended up being a 3-hour conversation. And she said the curious thing was that you didn't speak to her about her background at all. You just spoke about the business. Again, do you want to sort of share a little bit about your approach when it comes to...
Well, yeah. So I think in that case, Alison, I knew her backstory, I'd read her CV, and, she has a physics degree from Cambridge, a Stanford MBA. She was climbing the ladder at McKinsey. So, all the boxes of, is she smart enough? Yeah. You didn't have to sort of go down that rabbit hole, or can she deal with pressure, or can she solve complex problems, or can she unpack complex industries or companies, which are also the McKinsey training. So, you didn't need to unpack any of that. It was more, how did she think about the business of eBay, or how did she think about the opportunity? And you would hope someone coming to an interview for that role, to be the founding CEO of eBay in Australia, New Zealand, would have thought about it. And so she had, not surprisingly, she's a brilliant executive and now company director and company chair. And she came incredibly well prepared to talk about the business. So it wasn't that I didn't pay attention to her backstory. I didn't need to test her backstory. It was very clear that she was very, very good. And the two aspects, that the way she thought about the business and how clinical and thoughtful she was about what we needed to do in Australia, because we were starting behind a competitor, which was the Fairfax-led competitor to eBay. And we were a year or two behind them in launching the market. But also she's a really good human. And what came out very early on was, not only is she super, super smart, but she's a really, really good human being. And how lucky would we be to have someone running this sort of preeminent company who's incredibly smart, thoughtful about the opportunity, but also a very, very good human being. So that's, I think, why the combination made her so interesting and why the conversation went so long.
Yeah. And, part of that is, obviously bringing on people in your team, but also generally surrounding yourself with the right people. And someone else I spoke to was Anil, who mentioned that he reached out to you when he first moved to Australia. He was wanting to surround himself with the best of the best, and your name popped up. And so he reached out to you and said, looking for a mentor, something along those lines. And you replied with, I'm really busy, but try again in a year. And so he emailed you exactly a year later and said that you kind of caught up for coffee again, and went through with that sort of journey with him.
Yes.
Again, from your perspective, and everyone knows this. It's one of those sort of common things about surround yourself with the right people, form yourself an advisory board, or get mentors. Can be really difficult to do that. But I guess from the other side of that of the table, like, what do you look for when people reach out to you, or as someone that you want to?
So in that case, I think when you say you're going to agree to be a mentor for someone, you've got to first make sure you actually have something that's useful, because not all use cases you'll be good at or have advice that matters. And so you've got to make sure ego doesn't get ahead of skill set. So you could and should say no if, like, I actually don't know anything about that, so my advice will be dangerous. But also, do you have the time? Because I think the other thing mistake you can make is you say you'll do it and you don't give the time to really think through their unique situation and what will uniquely matter to them. So as a mentor, your responsibility is not just to pontificate on the future of mankind, but try and provide incredibly relevant advice that comes from domain experience and knowledge to their use case, to their set of issues. And in Anil's case, I was flat out prior, and I thought, I can't take on anything else. And so it was like, I don't have the time. Not in an arrogant way, but I literally don't have the time to give to anyone to do this. But when he came back, I then met with him, and I think, and we'll talk about the two sides of that. For me, it was, do you have someone who is smart, who wants to learn, who's happy to debate advice and not just take it on, but debate advice, and is looking to build a sort of relationship around this advice. So, he's probably the most unsung tech hero in the country. I mean, the guy's been a vice president at Google for many, many years. There is a handful of people, less than a handful of people, who've ever been a vice president of a product group in any of the major tech companies around the world. The big ones, the Facebooks, Microsofts, Apples, it's a couple. He's one of those, and he's constantly being given bigger and bigger opportunities. So he's an unsung hero, which is kind of weird because he should be on every panel and every advice anywhere. So he's got the skill set, he's got the intellect, but he wanted to learn and he wanted to debate the advice. I think, so that's what I look for that. So do you just want to write a list of things you want to run away, or do you want to talk about this and see whether my advice is relevant and how's it going to apply to you and what are your questions? And so there's this sort of, I think from when you're searching out as the mentee looking out, I think you don't just look for brand names, look for people that can add value within a particular set of area that you want. And I don't think that one mentor works across your whole, you might have someone who's really good for career planning, someone who's really good for life, that can talk about life, someone who's really good about giving advice on how to think about being a dad, someone who's really good about health, someone who's really good about thinking about when you want to move from a large organization to a small. So it's rare, if not impossible, to find one person. So my approach had been to try and find different people who could give me advice in different areas. And I said the same thing to others, that don't just look for one. Look for people who aren't just brand names. They're people who've got deep experience and have a center of excellence around something that you feel you want to learn off.
What's been the most valuable bit of advice that you've ever received? Or something that's stuck with you?
There's a great George Benson song, and it's about you sort of never found someone to be a mentor. And I've really not had them. I've searched. I really struggled to find. I think Bill would be the closest, but I did spend time with him, and I still talk to him every now and then. But it's not that deep. I mean, he's got more important things to do, and had even at that point. He was very influential in the way I think about business and problems and products. So I got from him through that relationship how to think about but in terms of other aspects of my life, I've had to do it the hard way, which is read a lot and think a lot. I probably analyze myself and my life and have for decades more than most people. Because of this, I just couldn't find people that could give me, well, I couldn't find, and I was also, I don't think I haven't got a very high level of self-esteem. So I could never ring up someone and go, hi. I could never do an Anil and ring up someone I didn't know who was reasonably successful and say, hey, would you be my man? There's just no way on God's green earth I could do that. I'd say, I'm an idiot. Why would they want to talk to me? There's no way I'm going to put myself in that situation. So there was a combination of I couldn't actually think of people, and I didn't feel confidence in myself that someone would say yes. So I did it the other way. I went and did a lot of studies. I did postgrad psych stuff. I read lots of books. I did a lot of self sort of development to find my way through.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I think to a point that this industry draws a lot of people with low self-esteem that are trying to prove themselves in one way or another, right?
Yes.
To themselves and to others around them. I've also heard you mention that a really big lesson for you was when you left Microsoft and when before everyone would reach out to you and want something from you because you had something to give to them. But then suddenly when you don't have that, the phone is not really ringing.
Yeah,
anymore.
It's an important lesson. So I was lucky. So I left Microsoft in the US, came to Microsoft in Australia, and then left initially to study, to do a PhD, which I never finished. And the moment I'd exited the ecosystem, nobody called. And I sort of thought, wow, that's, all these people who are my friends or, would call me often. I didn't really think about it a lot until then I joined eCorp, or joined the board of Publishing Broadcasting Limited, which owned Channel 9 and magazines and yada yada. And out of the blue, all these phones, Daniel, I haven't spoken to you in years, just thought. Now I went through that cycle, then I left PBL and sort of fart-assed around for a year or so trying to think what I would do, then came back with NetAss and so I've watched this pattern and I've got reasonably good pattern recognition, and the pattern recognition would summarize that most people in your life want you for what they can get out of you. They don't give a rat's ass about you. Most people in your working environment. And you will, if you have this sort of single trajectory of a career, you probably don't even notice that a lot of the people actually aren't your friends. They're actually they might like your company, but they're really attached to you because they want something out of you, either today or they can see in the future. The moment they realize you've got nothing to add, the phone stops. And I've had that not only stop, but then restart again. And it's a really good lesson that you need to spend your time, work and have work colleagues, but spend the time developing real relationships with people that you care about and care about you. And they become your center. They become the center of who looks after you and who you look after. They're your tribe.
Yeah. Having gone through that experience previously with Microsoft, was that even harder stepping away from venture capital and from AirTree?
Good question. So I haven't really ever talked about my departure from AirTree, and I probably won't now. But it was a combination of mental health issues and also just thinking through what I want to do when I grow up. And AirTree at that point had its third fund, was doing its fourth fund. First two funds are in really good shape. I think I'd proved out to the people who backed me with Fund 1 that they weren't going to do their dough. I think they've done very well. In fact, Fund 2 will also do well, and not as well, but anyone's fund who's not a Canva fund is never going to do as well as the Canva fund. So there's kind of there's everyone's Canva fund and then the rest of their funds, and they all drop off to a more normalized return profile. And I think when I came back to Australia, I'd come back infected with the philanthropy gene from Bill Gates. And I've spoken of this in the past, but I had this real sense that if you're, from Bill's mum, Mary Gates, that if you're successful in life, it's your responsibility to give back, not your choice. And that made a lot of sense to me. So we came back, we moved 35% of our wealth into our foundation, we started doing things. And so we've been doing it for a long time. But I just thought I wanted to do more there. There's a great quote from Martin Luther King, which ends with that life's most important question is, what are you doing for others? And I thought, I'm at the point where I don't need to worry about the mortgage. I don't need to worry about the kids. So it's not, there are other sort of things weighing on what I spend my time on. I should radically reshape my life to make sure I'm spending most of my time on helping others. Prior to that, since 96, we've had the foundation. So probably a quarter of my life was always spent on philanthropy. Well, now it's 75%. And that was the big decision. Other than the mental health issues I was going through at the time, it was this sense that I can't put my head on my pillow at night in the knowledge that I haven't done as much as I can within my own capabilities to either alleviate suffering or help create opportunity. So in a sense, it's a selfish thing. I want to be able to sleep well, and I can't sleep well if I know that I haven't done my best to help others.
Yeah.
So that became the sort of central focus going forward.
And is that where Start Giving was born from?
Yeah, so I did this sort of IRR calculation, which was if I moved another 5 million into our foundation over the next 5 years, you end up giving 250K a year because it's 5%, the 5% rule. And so I thought, okay, what if I use that money to try and grow giving in the tech sector by others, by introducing them to the concepts of philanthropy, by paying for the establishment foundations, by giving them advice, etc. So the idea of Start Giving was, how do you create a centre of excellence for philanthropic advice for tech founders with heritage in tech, and also with Antonia, my outstanding CEO, who's got the deepest experiences in philanthropy. And then our board is Bill Gates and Peter Singer. To then bring that to founders and just say, we're not making any fees here. We're just trying to introduce you to the idea about helping others and how to think about it. And if through that process over 5 years we can get to a multiple of 250K a year of new giving, then this has been a great IRR, great return on investment. And so that's it. So I think we're probably already now, a couple of years in, at sort of 4 or 5 million per year of new giving that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't spoken to some founders and introduced them to the idea. And by the way, not got them to move all their assets, but move a tiny bit across and start to experience, get the joy that you get from giving, the joy that you get from helping others, and let that grow. So Start Giving is a leveraged play, if you will, to create a culture of giving in the tech community. Our goal is to get, somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion more into giving, into the corpus that wouldn't be there. And that doesn't include the big end of town. Just this is sort of the founders with 20 or 30 million who might move $1 million across into a foundation and start giving. And how do you then have hundreds of these people who are in the tech community talking about giving and excited about the areas that they're helping alleviate suffering or creating opportunity, and show that you can be successful in your chosen career, but also you can reflect on the fact you're part of a broader humanity, that your role on planet Earth is not just about you and your family, it's about these poor kids in parts of Australia, around the world, who just have without help, they don't have the opportunity, or without help, they die. So it's that sort of...
It's something that Alison mentioned as well, of just how your approach and conversations with them have really opened their eyes to the world of philanthropy. But one of the things I think Alison mentioned was, it's not just about philanthropically giving, but also your considered nature with where will it make the most impact and what will that look like as well. Again, for any advice on founders that are thinking about this, how I guess it'd be interesting to see how you think about that, or how you...
Yeah, so I think it's, with us, it started through familial connection with my wife's mother died of breast cancer. My wife's mother's sister died of breast cancer. We had 3 daughters. We have 3 daughters. So now they've been tested. They don't carry the BRCA gene. But at the time, I thought this was semi-personal. I want to invest in the best breast cancer researcher in the country. And so it wasn't just like flicking money to a breast cancer group, and not there's anything wrong with that necessarily. I wanted to, how do we get the highest impact? And so long story short, we spent a lot of time, we found that Australia had Rob Sutherland, one of the top 20 researchers in the world in breast cancer. And I asked for a meeting with him at a Garvin, and I went to meet with him, and I said, "Hi Rob, I'm Daniel Petre," and I knew how much was required. I said, "I'd like to give you X million dollars to establish a chair in breast cancer that you would be." And for like 20 minutes, he said, "This is a joke. Who's put you up to this? Is this my brother?" And I said, No. He said, "People don't do this." And I said, "Well, I've researched you and you are the best guy in the country by a long way. And so I think it is that approach of trying to make every dollar go as far as it can without intervening. By that I mean, I'm not going to tell Rob Sutherland how to conduct breast cancer research. So in one of the other pieces of charity work we do is in Africa in digging water bores. And Anil actually and Scott and Kim and Gretel Packer help us there too now. And we sink bores around countries in Africa to stop children dying and girls getting raped. The impact's incredible. But I want to find the best way of doing it. What were the best bores, like pumps? What were the best pumps? Who's the best at digging bores? Not just saying, oh, that's fine. So I think is that sense of trying to make the money go as far as it can in an efficient way. Because if the money's going to efficient deliveries of a service, then by definition, the inefficient deliverers of that service should die away, as they should, and you have excellence. If money's just being sprayed around to everyone, you're never going to get excellence, and you're going to get diversification of funding, which is a bad thing. So I'm a huge fan of that. Now, fortunately, nowadays there are organisations you can go to. The Life You Can Save has a list of curated charities that they've tested to see who's efficient. There's GiveWell, and there's a bunch of places, if you haven't got the time, that you can go and find out who's good at this and then give them money if you don't want to do the work yourself. And I think that's what you should do. You should whatever your use case is, you should try as hard as you can without the resources you have and the time you have to invest in finding who's really good at this.
Yeah. Do you have would those particular resources the ones that you recommend founders start as a starting point?
Yeah. We have on the Start Giving website. There's a bunch of these there, and also we work with founders. Will say, "Well, look, I'm interested in X," and if we don't know anyone and they don't know anyone, sometimes people go, "Well, I want to do this. I know who I'm giving to. Great, off you go." In some cases, they go, "This is the use case I'm interested in. I'm interested in stopping youth who've been incarcerated, and recidivism, going back into jail. Who's good at this?" So in that case, we'll go look around and try and find 2 or 3 charities that have some data to show that they're good at it. We'll say, well, there's a couple, you choose one. So I mean, there are resources available, as I said, on our website and others. But if not, we also help founders.
Great.
Because they've got time to do it themselves.
Amazing. We'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes for anyone interested in finding out more. Daniel, obviously, as I mentioned, I spoke to a couple of people as part of the research process for this interview, which is one of my favorite parts of doing this podcast. But what's really interesting is the common themes that come up. And with you, there were definitely a couple of common themes. One was just your directness and truth seeking in things, fairness, but also the importance that you place on family and time. And you referenced this a little bit earlier in terms of family tragedy that you had when I believe your sister passed away on December 20th, 1992.
Yep, that's right.
I read your Medium article around that, which I thought was great as well, which again, I'll include into the show notes for anyone interested in hearing more about that story. But I guess, has that always been an important feature for you, or was that pivotal moment in...
there were 2 pivotal... I mean, I didn't grow up in a very happy family environment, so I didn't really experience either unconditional love nor what a functional family looks like. And I don't blame my parents, by the way. They were scarred from the Second World War. They came here as refugees. Their life was really hard. So I don't in any way judge them for that they led tragic lives, uprooted from their families and friends and not accepted into a country. Australia wasn't very accepting of certain ethnic groups in those days. So I don't blame them at all, but that was my experience, and I was the only WOG, in an Anglo-Saxon school, and it wasn't cool in those days. So I didn't really have it, and it didn't come to me from experience. But the 2 things that drove me to change the way I think was, one was first the birth of our first child, Grace, and it happened with Eliza and Alice too, which is the moment I held Grace in my arms, I had this overwhelming sense of love and care, and my only job is to make sure you have as fulfilled and happy life and healthy life as possible. It was just overwhelming. So I first started to go, oh, hang on a second, it's not just about career, and it's like, whoa, there's this other thing that matters. I still wanted to have a career, but it started, and I can remember my wife saying, I'd come home and say, where's Grace? And she'd be like 3 months old. When she's in bed. She's asleep. I said, well, I want to see her. Well, you've got to be home before 6 o'clock. Then I was home before 6 o'clock. And so, you start to make changes to accommodate this other thing that's important in your life. And then when Gabriella was killed, I was a a vice president at Microsoft, and there was discussions of senior vice president. There were 13 vice presidents, only 4 senior vice presidents. So it would have been quite a great career move if it had come off. And she was killed. And I can remember sitting in my chair in Building 16 and thinking, yeah, I need to invest in the family. You know, it was a binary choice. Do I stay and do that, or do I go home? And, you know, my niece was 6 months old, really badly injured in the accident. My sister was dead. My parents were grieving because only two siblings, myself and my sister. So it was very clear that I had to give that up. And I didn't feel anything. I thought, no, this is the right thing to do. So those two things. But what I worked out was, in both cases, I wanted to still have a career. I wanted to prove that you could be successful in your chosen career and also be a great dad and a great husband and a great friend. And I can remember, and I've talked about this, I'm sorry about repeating it, but just before coming home, my brother-in-law rang me and said, we need to put something on Gabriella's headstone. And he said, what do you think we should put on it? And we talked about it. And then I remember sitting back thinking, what would they say on my headstone? Vice president of Microsoft, soon to be or potentially be senior vice president. I thought, well, fuck that. I wanted to say, successful technology executive, great husband, great father, great member of the community, and great friend. I wanted to. Now, you can only say those things if you've done those things. So I literally set about recasting my life so that I could, as much as possible, tick those boxes and say I've spent time, I've spent resources in terms of time. I've been very thoughtful about my interaction with my children and my wife and my friends and charities, my work. I've allotted time to be efficient at work so I have more time for my family. So yeah, it became this driving force to prove you can do it. And I wrote a book about it, as you probably know, and pulled all the data on. You can. I mean, if you choose to, you can live a very successful career life and be a good and present father, friend, spouse. It's a choice.
And we spoke about that a little bit earlier, about how this industry in particular, attracts a lot of people who are very driven and ambitious, whatever the underlying motivations behind that, but it can become the central focus at the detriment of everything else. I guess when you made that decision, what did that look like for you, or what were some of the things that you put in place to find that balance for yourself?
I started in the US before I came back to Australia. So I started by restructuring the work meetings at Work Group, which was the group I ran, and things like no meeting could start before 9 a.m, which meant that if people, fathers or mums, wanted to drop their kids at school, they could, and then come to work. No meetings were allowed to start after 4 p.m, which meant if they wanted to, they could be home for dinner. We wouldn't have meetings unless a decision was going to be made. We wouldn't have CCs on things unless there was the bunch of things you do to take noise out of the system and to boundary condition the work hours. Now, of course, there were times, particularly in those days, when you're shipping a product, you're cutting 1 million CDs. If there's a bug on 1 million CDs, you've got a big issue. It's not like nowadays you just download a new code base to the web and off you go, right? So there were times where there was peak work, but then you had to say, well, that was peak, it's not normal. And so it was also conditioning behaviour. So if someone sent a note to me, timestamped 3 a.m. about an issue, historically they would have been given praise. And I said, well, what's wrong? Something wrong. Either, you're not competent for the role, you've got a competency problem, or the role's too big for you. And that, you could see people sort of reeling because they used to get applauded for that sort of work. I said, no, I'm not. No, that's... And the reality is, all the studies show that if you work more than for 9 hours a day, your productivity drops off like a stone, right? So not only is you not productive at work, but you're probably shit at the other things in your life. Secondly, work is a cancer. It will eat every minuscule cell of time you let it. The only way to keep it contained is by putting up hard lines and living those lines. And I have proven time and again, no matter what role you've got, if you're focused on efficiency, you can have a strong work day and still have time and energy to be a good spouse, partner, father, friend, mother, whatever. The idea that you have to work 70 hours a week to be successful is horse shit. It's because you let it. And you're not focused on efficiency, you're focused on work, take whatever you'd like, and what's left over I'll use for my family. And there's the Buddhists have got this great way of thinking about life, and it's my paraphrasing, it's not as eloquent as I've read, which is sort of that you need to think about every day, as though it's going to be your last day, but it's probably not. So there's tension between, what if it is my last day, but it probably isn't, so future and present. And I think that's a lovely tension to keep. So you're thinking about being present, but also understanding you're building for the future, and being conscious of that.
I think a really interesting example of that is something Anil mentioned, which is, he said that one of the things that he learned from you was that you used to drive your daughters to school every day. And there was just so much that you learned from that. And so now every day he drives his daughters to school. But one other thing that he mentioned as a counterbalance was when he had the opportunity to go to the US when he was at Google, and he was not sure if it was the right thing. And again, a lot of the time it can seem like a very binary thing of either you work really hard and you work 70 hours a week, or you just do family and you give up your career as a whole. And obviously it was a great career move. I think his daughters were 1 and 3 at the time, and he sought out your advice. And your advice was probably counter to what people would assume when you talk about putting family first, is like, actually it was the right time for him to go because it was the right thing, and the right thing potentially long-term for his family. Yeah.
So it was, his kids were so young, so they weren't in school. And of course for Jess, his wife, and it was an uprooting of their family, but the trade was the kids weren't at school, so there wasn't a lot of social impact on them or learning impact on them. Jess is a very vibrant and intelligent woman, so she was going to make a life. And it did let Anil try his hand. Could he be a head of a product group at Google? And, I think it was important. I thought he could, and I thought it was, he was working for Google here, but taking a major role. Yeah. It was important that he try that out.
He did mention that the specific advice he gave him was that he was great at being an all-star on a B team versus being, trying his hand at
you got, whether you first 11, first 15, whatever analogy you want, you go try it out. See, it's important to know. It was like he clearly was better as a product VP than I was as a product VP, much, much better. But both of us tried it. And I think it was important. It was the same as the decision we took when we went. Our daughter Grace was 2 when we went, and we made exactly the same trade-off. Carol and I talked about it. It's a trade for her. It's more impact on my wife than it was anybody else. Grace was fine. She was 2, but she was happy to let me have that opportunity to try it out. And I think as Jess was with Anil. So it was a family decision, but it was a right trade at the right time. If his kids had been 11 and 14, much bigger question. They're like, hang on, these are critical years in a girl's development, and they're sort of year 9. And you got to think about this. This is not as obvious a decision. At that point, it was pretty obvious.
Yeah. I had 7 different schools by the time I got to grade 7, but thankfully went to the same high school. So I can definitely attest to that.
Yeah, it's hard, right?
It is hard. Yeah. It is hard. But also thankful for the experiences. Yes. Well. We, moved around and lived everywhere, and I can tell myself a story of how beneficial it was, even though I hated it at the time.
And also, I think it also depends on the makeup of the individual. There are some, I have a very good friend who moved around similar to you, and is not, at least externally, not as content or fulfilled by that experience. Now, I don't know if you actually are, or you are putting on a very good face, but not all situations will impact everyone the same way. Yeah. And for some, the idea that you just got to build resilience in people is true, but not every interaction will suit every person. You've got to be careful you don't push people over the edge.
Well, I think sometimes hardships or difficulties can make you appreciate things a lot more. So I definitely in that moment hated it. But I remember when, I'm going on a massive tangent for the show, but I remember at the time I would watch movies and you would have these kids that grow up with childhood friends and things like that. And I was like, I never have that opportunity. I just want to have these friends that I get to grow with. But thankfully, when I got to grade 7 in school, we stayed in the one place, and I had an incredible group of friends. A lot of those friends were still in touch. We still do an annual trip together each year. And so I guess the trade-off for me is that I found that balance, and I'm like, I don't know if I would have appreciated it as much for what it is if I didn't have the counterbalance of that.
Yes. And the sad, you're alluding to, which is a sad truth, that we learn more in life from the things that have gone wrong than we do from things that have gone well, which is unfortunate, but true.
Yeah. And one other thing that Anil mentioned as well is just...
He talked a lot, didn't he?
He talked a lot. Like I said, I have pages and pages of notes. But one other thing that he mentioned was also coming back to Australia, where he thought that he got that opportunity to prove himself in the A team. But he thought that for him to move back, it meant giving that up. And again, one of the things that he mentioned that he was very grateful to you for was just opening up his eyes to the possibility of just asking if there is a way of restructuring that. But I think having that North Star of actually family comes first, but what is that right balance for me to be able to do both versus feeling like you're necessarily sacrificed?
And I think I also think, it's easy to say you can just be a cheerleader for someone on the sideline. You should try that. You go, son, kind of thing. If I didn't deep in my bones feel that Anil was an exceptional product head VP, I wouldn't have said, hey, go back and talk to Sundar and ask, because I would have thought that's just going to be uncomfortable for everyone. So I think I have been obsessed with truth my whole life. And my wife will tell you that I am way too honest with people. And I don't mean honest in the sense where, that I'm nasty. I just will be authentic. And often in life, you're not rewarded for being authentic. But I think it's important so that and if you're going to give bad advice to someone, or if I was going to tell Anil, hey, no, I wouldn't say, hey, no, you're an idiot, don't do this. You're not that good. I would work out a way to say it in a nice way. But in that case, he was clearly exceptional. And the proof had been what he'd done with photos, right? So he didn't have to go very far. He built, I think, the most successful product Google's ever launched from scratch to building 1 billion users. And, the fact that it was better than anything else that Apple had done. So there were a whole bunch of reasons you could say, oh, he's actually really good. So it was the right thing to do, to challenge his first level thinking, which is, no, I'm going to have to sort of step back.
Yeah.
But I think that search we shouldn't be, I don't know why people don't want to seek out the truth. I think if we were all focused on the truth, and by the way, being respectful of others and not causing harm in the delivery of truth, because it's such a much better place we'd be in if we're all honest with each other. And also I think if we're all honest with our, I talk about my mental health journey. I've had sort of mental health issues for most of my life, and I can track back why, I think. I'm sure it makes my family uncomfortable when I talk about that, but I think it's important because I think everyone's fucked up, which is all a bit, it's just the degrees of fucked upness. Yeah. And I think it's fine to say you have some mental health issues does not mean you're incompetent or incapable, and I think showing that you can have issues that you need to deal with, but you can still be incredibly competent, incredibly capable, incredibly thoughtful, is a much better role model than I'm this perfect human being. And those guys over there with the mental health issues, they're losers, but I am this sort of perfect human being. It's just not helpful.
Yeah. In terms of speaking the truth, it's interesting as you kind of mentioned that of, as you said, you sort of struggle with self-esteem yourself. It seems like you have an incredible ability to give self-esteem to other people around those sort of things, to believe in themselves and ask for things. Well,
I think I took on, we mentioned, I think prior to the podcast starting, this M. Scott Peck book, The Road Less Traveled. And, he talks about seeking truth being super important and taking responsibility for actions. Probably that's the other most important thing in my life, is that I try to, as much as possible, if I've hurt someone I didn't know I have, to quickly apologize, but apologize in a way that's meaningful to them, not meaningful to me. So to be really careful about causing harm. And if you have caused harm, now if you've caused harm you meant to, fine, okay. But if you caused harm you didn't mean to, then saying sorry seems such an easy thing to do. And I've met so many people in my life who just will never apologize. It's weird. But anyway, so the other thing he talks about, M. Scott Peck, which is the first chapter, and the first part of the first chapter, is you need to have experienced unconditional love. And I mentioned my experience. And my decision was, I can remember distinctly, was after reading the book, it would have been in the early 90s, saying, I'm going to give unconditional love to my wife, my children, and my close friends. And hopefully that, plus unconditional love they get from others, will help them have the ability to go out into life and try things and not feel constrained by a lack of self-esteem, that they'll feel they're good enough and they deserve the opportunity and they deserve to be treated with respect. So that's been a conscious effort.
Yeah. Daniel, I can speak to you for hours. I'm conscious that you've got a board meeting to get to, but just to kind of end on a final note, we kind of spoke about the balance of family time, with ambition, with work. Something Mark and I were speaking about with those sort of things, it's okay and easy from a founder perspective, almost what VCs will tell you when the company's going really well, to have the time to spend towards family and prioritize those sort of things. Imagine it's a lot harder in terms of doing that when the company isn't quite going right, and both what the VCs would want you to do. I know that you're not necessarily in the game, and again, easy to say things in hindsight, but I guess what's your perspective on that?
Well, I think it's, look, and that just goes whether you're an employee in a normal company, or you're an employee in a normal company struggling, or a normal company that's just doing okay, or a startup. I think in all use cases there, you have pressure on you to perform, and there will be times you'll need to work longer, but you have to be able to step back and say, am I living the life that brings me joy and fulfillment? Not every day can do that. So what I would do at the end of each week, and when I was working pretty stressful jobs, I would reflect back on my week. I'd spend a bit of time on a Friday afternoon after 5 before I went home, and look at my week and say, okay, how did I go as, for employees, for my performance, and as a dad, and if I had a few weeks where I'm going, well, I've been great at my work, but everything else has been a clusterfuck, I'd change it. And if that meant I'd have to change my job, then so be it. And so I think that's easy to say, but I think actually, if you're in a role and you find that consistently, whether it's a startup or not, you are unable to fulfill the other aspects of your life, then you have to find another job. I don't care what the company is or where their aspirations are. You have one life. You have one opportunity to develop a relationship with your children. You don't get to play that game again. 0 to 10, that's it. After that, good luck, sunshine. You'll have one opportunity to develop true and deep and lifelong friendships. These things do not present themselves every decade. So if you can have this consistent period where you're just unable to do anything other than work, and there's no sign of that abating, then you need to find another role, because at the end of the day, it's your life that matters, not just your job.
Daniel, thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. I think so useful and so important for a lot of founders that don't necessarily get to hear about a lot of the other sides of things. So thank you for this conversation, but also everything you've kind of done for the ecosystem as well. I'm sure you don't hear that as much as you should. But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Rohit and James, thank you very much. I feel like, thanks for the questions, and they were really deep and really insightful. I hope I did add some value. So thanks very much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to episode 180 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.